Right, so next we'd like to introduce George Mitchell. George created and runs Focus Perform as his consultancy, which provides a platform of information around psychology of sport and exercise. He recently was accredited with BASIS and has experience in a range of sports, working with a variety of athletes of different ages, gender, levels, and backgrounds. George provides sports psychology support within sports science teams to athletes, teams, coaches, and parents, with interventions being individualized, evidence-based, measurable, and impactful. It is his aspiration to guide service users to produce positive, significant, and long-term changes in life so that the user can perform consistently at the highest level to achieve their sporting goals. George's talk will be about how coaches can help players build mental resilience. So George, if you're there and you're ready to share your slides, please go ahead.
Yep, sure.
Perfect, thank you.
Is that all working?
Yeah, that's lovely. We can see your slides.
Lovely. 1 second. Lovely. So hi guys, welcome. Hope you've had a great conference day so far. Today I'm going to talk about how coaches can help players or athletes build mental resilience. If you have any questions at all, then please put them in the chat and I'll happily cover them at the end. It would have been great to have done this live and in person, could have interacted a lot better, but we're having to cope and this is still good nonetheless. I've added a couple of tasks to try and make it a little more interactive as well. So like Emily said, I've been working as a sports psychology practitioner now for about 3 years and have sent off my final report for accreditation with BASIS. So there's 2 routes in the UK to become a sports psychologist, so either with BASIS or BPS. Prior to this, I completed my undergrad and master's at Bangor University, which I absolutely loved. And the experiences learned at Bangor really held me in good stead throughout my accreditation. And definitely throughout master's degree, a lot of resilience was needed. That's for sure. For me, I guess I really became interested in learning more about resilience a few years back after having a great lecture at university around resilience. I started paying more attention to how it was perceived in sports. So you hear commentators in sports games talking about bouncing back. Even though I'm not a great fan of this this terminology, and players talking about how they needed to be more mentally stronger in games. And then I got thinking about this terminology and whether sports like enthusiasts really knew what mental resilience was, and then thinking about how this could then be brought into youth sports to build a more mentally resilient player, not just in terms of performance, but well-being as well. So this term is used all the time. Dr. Sarko referred to it earlier that if you went on Amazon and searched at resilience, you'll be bombarded with lots of books around resilience or self-help books. A lot out there won't be scientific or won't have, if any, evidence support how to become sort of resilient. And this is sort of how I got into looking at the frameworks of mental resilience and how to bring this into sport and support players by using more scientific evidence-based work and avoiding books by ultra-crepidarians. Within my experiences as a sports psych practitioner, I've been very fortunate. I've worked with a couple of different elite academies with a fair few individuals across different sports, backgrounds, abilities and capabilities. I've been really fortunate to work with a range of athletes so far, and especially being quite a neophyte practitioner, I've learned a lot from this work. So that's a bit about me. Now, today we're going to look at a framework for how coaches can help build mental resilience in their players. I will share my experiences as well with mental resilience, working with players and coaches or the academy that I'm at. And I'll sort of cover that towards the end after we've been through that framework. So quick sort of 60-second task here. I put these questions here, firstly, to make this a little more interactive, and secondly, to use for you to get to reflect about what mental resilience means for you, and who has had maybe who has had like influence over you and your resilience, and how they've done this. If you'd like to share them and put it in a conversation box, or keep hold of the thoughts as we move through the slides, that would be great. So 60 seconds to just have a little think about these questions. So now you've had a little time to reflect and sort of to see how that applies with you. We're going to look at now the sort of influence of mental resilience over athletes. Although this will solely be focusing on the coaching side of things, it's important to be aware that resilience is learned through many different people. Connaughton in 2008 highlighted that the importance of the environment on development of mental resilience was that the influence of parents, coaches, siblings, senior athletes, sports psychs, and other support staff. Maybe that physios as well. I mean, the amount of times players spend in the physio rooms, they'll all have an influence over the development of mental resilience and the support that you have, or that the athletes have. And also reported that the influence of a broader social networks on development of mental resilience as well. So vicarious learning, so observations and listening to other sources as well, has a sort of a wide range of people influencing the mental resilience. I put on here 2 percentages. What do you think these percentages means in terms of coaching and mental resilience? So you've got 82 and 9%. If you just want to have a sort of a guess to yourselves, what you think that these mean. So 82% of coaches rated that mental resilience. They've rated it as the most important psychological attribute in determining success. This was percentages based on a study in wrestling, and 9% believe that they were successful in developing mental resilience within their athletes. So you can see here there's quite a massive discrepancy between the two percentages. This sort of really highlights the need for coaches to know more about the development of know how to develop resilience in their athletes. I mean, this study was done a fair few years ago, so it would have been great to have some updated percentages now that there is more research up to date. So this was done, okay, if I can remember correctly, about 10, 15 years ago. So there's a lot more research being produced recently. And then we've got Eddie Jones, a quote from him, which I found online. I think it was from The Guardian, but don't quote me on that. He says that he believes that resilience can be taught, even though he used mental toughness here. We're trying to steer away from using the term toughness, mental toughness. And he says that he brings it into his sessions, as he says he's trying to teach his players about being comfortable in the uncomfortable situations. It would have great to have seen, or if he had shared, how he tries to teach that. So the framework we're going to look at today is by Weinberg in 2016. So we did a study where they interviewed 15 sports psychologists with regards to how they feel coaches should or could build mental resilience in their athletes. So the cohort of sports psychologists were experienced sports psychs who had either accepted research in publications or journals, or who had applied expertise. So worked in teams or with individuals, which are focused on building mental resilience. And they came up with thoughts on their experiences and research, which provides this framework that's displayed on the slides. So this framework is split into two: how the coaches think and what they do, whilst being purposeful with these thoughts and actions to develop mental resilience in their players, and really to create a facilitative environment. This framework is looking at how to build resilience in players, not a resilience team, as there are a lot of other factors that are involved, like leadership styles, team learning, making sure that they're on the same wavelength, social identity. So thinking of themselves as a we and an us rather than individuals. I believe Dr. Sarkar spoke briefly about this earlier in his previous chat. So we're going to explore firstly how coaches think about their players. To build mental resilience, sports psychologists recommend that coaches should be challenging, but also encouraging their athletes. For this to be challenging, informative feedback needs to be accepted. The point for this to be accepted is that coaches need to establish a strong relationship with their athletes, as they will be more willing to allow their coaches to provide informative and constructive feedback. Also, when providing constructive feedback, coaches need to be clear that this feedback is to help athletes learn and improve their skills. A book I highly recommend for coaches to build these relationships with their athletes is Coaching Athletes to Their Best, a motivational interviewing in sport. That was by Stephen Rollnick, and there's some other authors who are named in that book. A bit wary of sharing book recommendations, but this is one I'd recommend for building relationships with athletes. So when building mental resilience, coaches should think about how their players the coaches should think about their players as individuals who desire a sense of personal control. So this autonomy gives a player a sense of competence or confidence, as they feel that their coaches have faith within their decision making. This confidence then helps athletes make decisions on their own when the stress is high, during competition, therefore increasing chances of success, whatever success is for that person. Also, increased autonomy will enhance an athlete's intrinsic motivation, sense of responsibility, effort, moral development. Ultimately, coaches would like to create better people as well by giving athletes a greater sense of autonomy, and this would allow more of a long-term development. Weinberg noted that one of the sports psychs said that a coach should create an environment where athletes get their own choices, sense of volition, internalized control, and specific feedback. So there are aspects of developing mental resilience that require a coach to be caring, nurturing, and supportive of building autonomy. Research has suggested that coaches who form an autonomy supportive environment have athletes that are greater in intrinsic motivation. Also, they feel greater competence within their abilities, show greater sporting behavior, and have greater autonomy when making decisions. So the sports psychs in the studies, they suggest that various things coaches could do to help build an athlete's autonomy include, for example, providing athletes with options, giving them opportunities to use their initiative, so designing sessions on their own perhaps, or by creating like a general democratic environment, so they feel that their coaches listen to what they have to say. I know it was mentioned earlier that coaches need to create an environment which is high challenge, high support, rather than a low challenge, low support, or a high challenge, low support, and low challenge, low support. So when running workshops with coaches, I always get them to have a think about what a high challenge, high support environment looks like to them, so that they can reflect whether their environment is facilitative or not, and what they can do to make it so. So athletes are individuals. So everyone has their own way to respond to criticism with different strengths and weaknesses. Getting to know each person as an individual is something throughout the coaching literature that has been really stressed. And Gilbert in 2006 did a paper about this. With regards to mental resilience literature, though, it's not really been emphasized too much. Effective coaches need to know their athletes' attitudes, coping styles, personalities, and motives. So coaches also need to know the ways to create an environment favorable for allowing the development of mental resilience to take place. So another suggestion is for coaches to ask their athletes to write down 3 things that they want coaches to know about them, especially in terms of mental resilience. Again, this could be dependable on the age group, whether this task could be appropriate for them. But sport can be a very busy and quick environment, and getting to know the players can be time consuming for coaches. But this information could help devise a more player specific sessions for increasing mental resilience. One story that comes to mind when talking about this is a story about Roy Keane. This is one that I heard from Bill Beswich, who was Alex Ferguson's go-to man. So Steve McClaren was a coach at the time under Sir Alex Ferguson, and he held his first session at Manchester United as a coach. He wanted the players to have some fun so that they like him as a coach. Within a few minutes, Roy Keane stormed off. And if you know who Roy Keane is, you could probably imagine what this would look like. So McClaren then phoned Keane to understand why he had stormed off. And Keane said that the training session was rubbish, and I'm paraphrasing that here, and that he needed to have a hard training session so that he feels he is ready for the game on the weekend. So this highlights that the coaches really need to know their athletes, and not just in terms of building resilience, but to get them performing to their optimum level in training and for matches as well. Part of coaching is thinking about themselves as a coach and about their staff. For example, assistant coaches and whoever else they have with them, and how they all function with the players. So the sports psychs in this interview, when creating this framework, they suggest that when building mental resilience, coaches should take a multi-dimensional approach. That when trusting a range of different techniques that come together to reach like the end goal of a player who is mentally resilient. But that's not, when I say an end goal, mental resilience is on a continuum. It's not like one fixed thing. Once you're mentally resilient, you're mentally resilient for life. It doesn't quite work like that. But this means that they're on the same page and passing on the same message, whether you're on a coaching side, nutritional, or physiological side. So with education, to be able to educate, you first need to gain the knowledge and know-how and how to best deliver it. This could involve reading the literature about mental resilience strategies, attending coaching education seminars or conferences such as this, attending to sports psych specific conferences and speaking to professionals who can help with these strategies are just some of the options available. But just because a coach has attended such lessons, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're fully capable of building mental resilience in players. Like anything, it is a skill that needs to be practiced and reflected upon in their sessions. This education could lead to the coaches educating their athletes by getting them, this is one example, by getting them to reflect upon their experiences in their sport or life and what they have learned from previous games, races, competitions, depending on the sport. with regards to setbacks and adversity. So coaches can perhaps initiate meetings with the players and get them to keep diaries, for example, where they can record their thoughts, feelings, to help with the reflection process. So now moving on to the framework, the more of the right side of it and what the coaches do. This part is to do with building adversity. So the most consistent response from sports psychs that were interviewed was that coaches should create situations that are stressful, difficult and adverse when looking to build mental resilience. So it was said that if coaches create adversity in practice for their athletes, then they would then develop particular coping strategies to deal with different difficult situations, and more effectively when facing them in future competitions. So not only should athletes develop coping strategies on their own, coaches should teach their athletes specific coping strategies to effectively deal with these adverse situations. So players should be regularly challenged so that they avoid comfort zones, where they are confident and comfortable with their abilities. The idea of putting athletes in these types of adverse situations is to create the feeling of being uncomfortable, like Eddie Jones said in the quote, which I shared a few slides back. And if coaches want to increase an athlete's feeling of competence, then they should be giving more challenging tasks to achieve. These challenges, though, shouldn't be so tough that the athletes can't complete them and therefore risk threats to themselves. They should be difficult but attainable. They should push our athletes to their limits, where they can experience achievement by putting in that hard effort. And this effort here should be praised, and perhaps not praise the talent that they may possess. And then when in situations, games, races, competition, they have actually dealt with these adverse situations previously, and therefore are more likely to be able to react to the challenge in a more of efficient and effective manner. Some of the situation, in some situations, to create adversity, you could use distractions that could be brought into the training environment in order to create greater stress and imitate game conditions. For example, if we choose basketball, by having loud noises or music, and maybe perhaps bring in some fans, or even their hands and banners in practice sessions could bring about that stress. This could sort of act as distractions. So when they're practicing their free throws, they do need to concentrate. So that's one way of bringing in a distraction. Psychological pressure as well could be introduced by having players solve certain problems. One way for coaches to do this could be to present players with different demands in the environment and asking them to deal with things such as different defending strategies in football, perhaps different wind or putting conditions in golf, perhaps rainy or snowy conditions in kicking practice in rugby. Although this would be hard to make happen unless you knew like a rain dance or something, but making use of these bad weather situations and using them to your advantage could be useful. So the importance here is to have the players trying to solve these conditions independently. When I run these mental resilience workshops with coaches, I get them to discuss, maybe in small groups, how they can bring adversity into their training sessions, and hear sort of different ways coaches can do this, but making sure that it is psychologically safe for the players. Also alongside their developing, alongside their developing of adversity, I get them to think about how they offer sort of support in times of high adversity situations. So having mentioned diversity a lot, I thought provide a definition. It's not the one on the screen, but circumstances or stresses in someone's life that are associated with negative responses or adjustments that are known as adversities. They have the potential to interfere with an individual's normal functioning and are person specific. meaning an adversity for one may not be adverse for another. And when talking about adversity, I remember a story from university about a gymnast who was away at Olympics. She was really high functioning and was set to win gold at that Olympics. But when she was in her room beforehand, during the stay over at Olympic Village or wherever they were staying, can't even remember which Olympics it was, her teammates moved her things about, and she liked to have everything perpendicular for whatever reasons she had, and this affected her normal functioning. And then this was enough adversity to throw her off of her concentration in her performance. To get a gold, she ended up, I think it was fifth, if I remember correctly from the story. So just creating that much adversity or dysfunction with how she normally functioned was enough to make her lose gold. Within the picture on the slide as well, this may have come up today already. What your plan looks like, it won't necessarily be linear. There'll be lots of peaks and troughs and times of adversity. And to have, as you as coaches, or if there are any coaches, by helping your players out of these adversities or creating situations and supporting them through it, it could be very useful within getting out of that trough. So adversity in sport. So there's a few different types of adversity here. During these times of COVID now, athletes who have been preparing for events could have all faced these adversities. For example, the Olympics last year was cancelled. So athletes who have been preparing for years may have missed out. I don't know what's happening this year with it, but there's these adversities will bring about different sort of beliefs and behaviors that people have attached to this adversity. I'll go into this a bit later on. But us as a general public facing the same or similar adversity due to COVID. So we've all faced the effects of, like, some maybe lost loved ones. We've had poor leadership, uncertainty with guidelines due to COVID. I could go on, but I won't go on. I feel that might be a political rant there. But even working in the sports psychology field, we've had to face these challenges and adapt, and having to work online and sort of adapt our practices as well. When I mentioned support earlier, I always talk to coaches about having two dials, a stretch dial and a support dial. I don't think there's anything wrong with giving players advance warning that they're going to be engaged in a tough to achieve activity session in training, but the tougher you make it, the more stretch there is. So if you have the two dials, the more stretch you have, the more the increased support is needed. So this support comes in the shape of coaching behaviors, so voice or lack of at times, body language, attitude towards mistakes, failures, as well as other sort of forms of support, such as giving players the mental skills or knowledge to deal with these situations. So I mentioned earlier that coaches should teach athletes specific coping strategies to effectively deal with these adverse situations. And it's not just solely the athletes learning about coping strategies themselves. And I think quite a nice quote to sum this up is, if you were to chuck a human in a box who is scared of snakes to fend off the snake without a stick, then the human won't be able to fight off the snake. That's sort of demonstrated in that picture on the side there. Now, moving on to the last section within that framework, so the mental skills training. So there was a sort of scarcity and literature with regards to the contribution of mental skills training to the development of mental resilience. This is probably due to the ambiguity around the concept of what mental resilience is, and lack of psychometric measures of mental resilience. However, more recently, that there is more studies coming to light. Connaughton, who I mentioned earlier, found that athletes reported the independence of psychological skills with regards to sort of maintaining mental resilience. So it was reported that positive self-talk and goal setting can be contributed to the development of mental resilience. And also vicarious experiences and appropriate role models were also found to play a contribution to the development of mental resilience. So again, there's a lot of factors influencing mental resilience, and it's not just one characteristic. So ABCs, some of you, well, if you've watched Mustafa Sarkar earlier, he talked a lot about learning the ABCs with form of cognitive therapy. As Mustafa covered it earlier, I won't go into that. Just provide maybe another example, so that the A could be a poor performance in a previous game. B could be the belief that they're going to perhaps buckle under pressure during the next game because they've had that poor performance, and the behavioral sort of consequence could be that they may be more irritable or increased anxiety or perhaps lower motivation because of that their belief to that adversity. And perhaps this is a realistic or perhaps a rational belief. So the coach or sports psych or perhaps parent could dispute or ask good questions around this belief to make them more aware that there is a belief and it's not just straight from A to C. I mean, you could probably spend a good couple of hours lecturing about this framework, which is really interesting. We've also got self-talk there. So I mean, in terms of resilience and how people are taught to view, not taught to view, but could view situations and challenges rather than threat states. And if they're facing tons of adversity, what are players or athletes going to be telling themselves? So positive self-talk phrase could be brought in, something that perhaps is meaningful to them, which would replace the negative self-talk to then increase their motivation. Self-talk could also be an instruction or a focus to a certain attention, like for example, tackling in rugby, looking at the hips would be one example. We've also got reframing thought, so it's quite similar to learning the beliefs with ABCs. This is a technique used by sports psych to help with reframing how a person perceives and thinks about certain situations, so they could modify how they approach certain situations. By adapting the thought structure that emerges in the response of these circumstances, it is possible to change how a person responds to these circumstances and ultimately improve the outcome, or hopefully outcome, of these situations. Also put some imagery in there. So imagery allows an athlete to mimic maybe a real life experience using different senses. Studies has found that it can increase self-confidence. This works as a way of maintaining existing skills and skill development as well. The more vivid and realistic the images become, the more likely that they're going to be interpreted by the brain as identical to the actual event. This would increase the effectiveness of mental practice and provides maybe additional training, so they won't have as much physical impact on the body as training could be. I have worked with an athlete who said before that her coach had gotten her to do some work with imagery. He did it so that he could use it as an example for his project so that he can move up the coaching levels. He did, however, get her to read the imagery script, which may not have allowed for the imagery to take place, or definitely not form as great as imagery in her mind. So even though the thought is there sometimes from coaches around psychology and applying mental skills, it does need to be carried out in the proper, appropriate way. You've also got what if planning here as well. So this is probably one of the most used strategies in sports psychology. This has like great uses in terms of preventing and planning against potential crises. So this process is to firstly identify the parts of the competition that the athlete is worried about. Secondly, is to develop some plans and strategies to prevent them from occurring. And finally, to prepare what they would do if stresses were to occur. It is wholly focused on the individual athlete and what they fear, meaning it's personalized and allows them to feel in control of the upcoming competition or event, again, depending on sport. It can be used for a specific competition or could be used throughout the season, so it doesn't derail the athlete. You've also got goal setting there. There are some other strategies, but with goal setting, it helps improves athletes' motivation, commitment, helps them to stay focused on what to accomplish, helps assess strengths, weaknesses, as well as being able to track performance and improvement during a season. You've probably heard of the SMART acronym used for creating a goal. So that's the end of the framework. Now I'm going to sort of provide an example of what this looks like in practice. So a rugby academy that I work with, they asked me to bring in a program for players at the 14-15 to start to learn about goal setting and reflecting. And then it took off and they asked me to develop other areas to create a program around mental resilience, incorporating a lot of different factors here. At this age group, it's quite a big academy, so they have a couple of hundred players spread over their campuses, meaning that this program was based on the mass before the academy starts to narrow down their selection. I mean, it would have been great to build personalized and individualized programs for each individual, but financial resources, logistics wouldn't cater for this at the moment. It's probably a long way off from being able to financially do that. So we outlined the program, aligned it with the 18s and first team for continuity. We made sure that the language was consistent and whether it was pitched to the right level and how it could be developed through the academy. And what's important here was that the club bought into this process and wanted it as part of their culture and philosophy, and it came from the top down. So the coaches at the top were really they really bought into this process. We've got coaching here. This is probably what the majority of this work focuses on, developing the coaches. So the coaches knew that the program was being run, what the program consisted of, and how they could respond if a player were to ask them a question with regard to the weekly challenge, for example, or if anything that occurs in the program itself. The coaches have access, so we use Padlet, so they could access all the challenges, resources as well, to get themselves thinking about what the players are going through, so that they are well informed about the whole process. So within this, I've got educational pieces. So we do a couple minute videos on the weekly, so that players start to learn about their own belief systems to create more awareness. Give them challenges about how to reflect on their performances, in addition to the mental skills as well, which we talked about previously. Challenges, one example could be if they've done some learning about what self-talk is and have seen examples from the first team, then another week following, they'd have a challenge to create their own sort of positive self-talk phrase to use in certain situations which would be suitable for them. And that means that, and that phrase is something that they would use rather than just being a sort of tick box sort of exercise for them to do. So we want to get them really engaged in that process. We've also got feedback in there as well. So throughout this program's run throughout the season, I've got also points there where they can ask for some feedback, or they can provide feedback about it to see which bits they like and didn't like and what they've taken on. This is done on an anonymous basis as well, so you can feel free to open up about it. So I mentioned Padlet as well that we use. We have recordings on there from the first team players, and they provide examples of mental skills that they use within. So you've got role model examples And we've used group sessions as well, so they could discuss certain topics and share it with their teammates. And we also have a system to team me, for example, player Joe Blogs, let's say, we would talk to him about how he would have support from his coaches, parents, friends, siblings, psych staff, etc. And we go into how they would interpret the support. We've ran workshops for the parents as well to look at their support. So we have a whole holistic support around the athlete. Thank you for listening. Some resources that I would share, some great podcasts there. Some other great ones I'd recommend around sports psychology would include Insights by MindGap, Sports Psych Network, Performance Psychcast, Supporting Champions, Steve Ingham, and the others listed on the screen. The book as well, this is the Resilience Factor. As I mentioned, some books aren't very evidence-based and practical in nature, but this book really does offer some practical advice that you can use. It's not sport related, but for the general public, it's great. It has 7 really practical strategies that and helps you perhaps beliefs with certain situations, and for example, advice around bringing up children with a relationship, so different aspects of different types of adversity. It gets you thinking about your ABCs as well, which was really useful, and I really did enjoy reading that book. I have my contact details as well on the screen, so if you don't have a question now and feel like maybe there's one later on that comes to mind, then feel free to send me a message. Yeah, are there any questions?
Firstly, thank you, George. That was such a great speech. I think it really tied together a lot of the concepts we've gone over today in our conference, and it's been put into a very practical way for us to use it in our everyday lives or with patients in the future. So thank you so much.
No worries.
We do have a couple of questions. So firstly from Mohammed, do you think failure builds mental resilience, which leads to future success? For example, Liverpool winning the league after just missing out the year before.
Yes. Yes and no. I mean, this is could be person specific as well. Just because you've failed something might not necessarily learn from that mistake. It depends maybe what your mindset is towards that mistake. So you have to be with your learning or your thought process towards failure. That could be a massive sort of massive factor in that. Yeah, did I answer that? Kind of went off a bit there.
And then I've just got a question. From your experience when working with sports teams, is it more beneficial to work on mental resilience with the team as a whole, or is it better with an athlete individually, or do you try and use a mixture of these two concepts?
I guess we use a mixture. We have, with the academy I'm working at the moment, we've got opportunities where the players can come in and talk about certain psychological things themselves. But there's also times to target the group as well and get them thinking about their team identity, their different sort of leadership teams as well. So it's not just one sort of characteristic around mental resilience. There's a lot of things which sort of come together which helps build this resilience.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's the questions for now, but if anyone's got any more questions, do just pop them in the chat, and George, if you're happy to answer them when and if they come through.
Certainly, I'll stay on for a bit.
Cheers, thank you so much for speaking for us. I'm now going to hand over to Kabir to introduce the last aspect of our conference. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm back. So for this last bit, Molly, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah, hi. I'll just introduce you and then I think we should just get into it. So last in our lineup, we're delighted to introduce the leader of our workshop,